It's my great pleasure to introduce three speakers for the second session. Armin Grünbacher starts by talking about KfW and the years in which the institution was created after the Second World War. Then after that, Zeliha Saya, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, talking about public banks in Turkey, and Ilaria Pasotti talking about IMI or IMI, an Italian development bank, state-owned development bank with a very interesting paper. I'm going to be very rude in terms of timekeeping, but please excuse me for that. And we just straight away go to Armin to start. It's your turn, please.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Politics of Pragmatism, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau as a bridge between a state and private banks and businesses during the West German Reconstruction period. To answer that question that came earlier, should Ireland have a state bank? Based on the model of the Kreditanstalt, I would definitely say yes. State banks are nothing new in Germany, but the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, the KfW, stands out. Before the KfW, there had been things like the Preußische Seehandelsgesellschaft, and then in particular in the Weimar period, the Reichskreditgesellschaft. The KfW is different. I'm trying to make 5 points here in this paper. That first one is that although the KfW has been called a German institution, it is actually set up, organized, initiated by the Allies. It is the supervisory board in its early years that is very important for the corporation's work, and that makes it stand out as a good example of what Abelshauser termed the corporate state. Points 3 and 4 overlap, and these are the crucial points for the politics of pragmatism. It is the person and the role of Hermann Josef Abs within the bank, number 3, and within the wider economy and society, number 4, that makes the KfW probably more effective. And then finally, I'll argue that the KfW is a state bank, but it is not state-controlled. The KfW as an Allied creation. Although Andrew Schonfield has coined the phrase a characteristic German institution, the bank is not the brainchild of Hermann Josef Abs, as claimed by Abs, and then the claim further spread by Manfred Pohl's book, Wiederaufbau. We come on details on that a little bit later. A matter of fact, the KfW is a result of British and American disputes over banking policies during the period 1947-1948. It is the British who try to have some form of centralized banking system in order to finance the reconstruction of the Ruhr, because back home in Britain, there is no money to pay for the occupation of Germany. The Americans, on the other hand, wanted to have a decentralized system. What is very interesting is that during the gestation process, that is July 1947, when the British make the first proposal for a corporation for reconstruction loan, and June 1948, when the Bi-Party Control Office, BICO, issues the principles for a reconstruction loan corporation, once that happens, the gestation process is taken over by the Germans. In contrast to the principles outlined by the Allies, the Germans claim supervision of the bank. They increase the supervisory board membership from 8 that had been suggested by the Allies to 20. And as a means of funding for the bank, they suggest that Marshall Plan counterpart funds should be utilized as well. Matter of fact, the counterpart funds will become the largest section of funding up to the late 1950s. This in itself shows that John Gimble is absolutely right with his claim, or this is another proof of Gimble's claim, that Allied actions in 1948 cannot happen against German resistance. The more the Allies want to build up a German state, the more they have to rely on German cooperation. The makeup and the significance of the Verwaltungsrat is quite an interesting point. The Verwaltungsrat, the supervisory body, is made up first and foremost of the chairman and the deputy chairman who were appointed by the bizonal executive council, the Verwaltungsrat des Vereinigten Wirtschaftsgebietes, after the creation of the Federal Republic by the federal government. Membership consists of equal numbers, first 3, then after the creation of the Federal Republic of 4 members from the central government, plus the equal members from the land representatives. There are 4 members from the banking sector covering different sectors of a banking sector, plus ex officio a member of the Bank Deutscher Länder, the central bank. There is, of course, 1 representative from agriculture, and there are 3 representatives from different sectors of industry, and also quite interestingly, to match those industrial representatives, there are 3 trade union representatives on the board. In contrast to what Thielmann Pünder has said in his implied in his book Das Bizonale Interregium, there are actually very fierce ideological battles over the board membership, in particular in regard to the representative of the housing industry. Should it be somebody from the private housing association or from non-profit organizations? This brings us now to the person of Hermann Josef Abs. Without a doubt, Abs is the central figure within the KfW's first 20 years of operation. Since 1945, out of office at Deutsche Bank, he is the unofficial advisor to the British military government, and he is also the unofficial advisor to German industry. His reputation by 1947 is such that he is visited by Richard Whitehead, President Truman's special representative on German reconstruction. And Abs gets involved in German response to the Allied principles for the RLC, and he gets also most likely involved in the drafting of the KfW bill, in particular the use of counterpart funds utilities. Abs, however, in his position of helping to draw up the law, makes also sure that the KfW will not become a competitor to private banks in the same way as the Reichskreditgesellschaft had been in the 1920s and 1930s. Abs had been rejected in April 1948 for the presidency of the Directorate of the Bank Deutscher Länder. Usually the claim is that he did not take the post because some important demands he had were rejected by the Allies. I think this claim cannot be substantiated. There's documentary evidence in the archive of the Bundesbank that where the Americans had explained to Bundesbank Bank Deutscher Länder board member that Abs will be rejected for political reasons. The French apparently didn't like him. What is interesting and shows Ab's influence as well is that he is although on the supervisory board, he is nominated into the Vorstand, the executive board. And even more interesting is that although the law stipulates that if this happens, he should cease the activities on the supervisory board. He doesn't. Abs remains on a member of 6 standing committees, supervisory board standing committees, usually as chairman or at least deputy chairman. Abs then is crucial in providing KfW loans to companies without proper securities. On the one hand, there are the coal mines. This is very obvious. The coal mines had been expropriated. But it's more interesting in the case of the Carl Zeiss optical company, which at the time had been just relocated to the rural backwaters of Württemberg, where they still are today, thriving. It is only when Abs provides some less than 5 billion marks of loan via the KfW to Zeiss that other local banks come forward and provides further loans. So here Abs is crucial. KfW becomes crucial for confidence building. It's very interesting to note also that between 1949 and 1950, half of the loans given by the KfW are given as direct loans. Abs is also the one who pushes the importance of export finance, that credits is given to exporting companies to cover their cash flow until the payments are made. This has to be seen in the context of the balance of payment crisis the Federal Republic is in 1949, 1950, 1951. And in this way, as the KfW says, they are going to close, quote, a gap in the national economy, eine volkswirtschaftliche Lücke schließen. The export credits by 1951 amount to some more than 700 million. As soon as the crisis is over, these loans, 600 million of those loans, are handed over to the newly created Ausfuhr Kreditanstalt, a consortium of private banks. So here is a sign that...
May I remind you of the time, please?
Abs outside post and positions are also important. He is a member of Adenauer's kitchen cabinet. He holds about 20 supervisory board memberships, usually chairmanships, at deputy chairmanships, and most prominently, he is the head of the German London Debt Conference in 1953. So he is the central figure for the reforming of the Deutsche Bank. So he has his fingers in every pie. This means he has the influence to convince the banking community to get a guarantee for the KfW's first bond issue in 1949, which is a disaster, quite frankly. Of the 50 million bonds sold, 28 millions have to be taken up by the banking consortium. Abs is, in Lothar Gall's words, the spokesman of Deutschland AG in the 1950s and the 1960s. In 1993, Forbes called him, that's a year before the man dies, the most powerful man in Germany by some distance. The KfW is a state bank, but not controlled by the state. In the case, this is most prominent in the case of politically motivated loans to Yugoslavia in the early 1950s. These are export loans. When the other export loans are handed back to the AK, 126 million loans to Yugoslavia stay with the Kreditanstalt because they are just dodgy loans. There's a high risk that they will default. When the KfW then in 1952 is asked not asked, told by the government to increase those loans by a further 38 million, of which the KfW has to provide another 8 million of their own, the reaction is just furious. And on stipulation, they write to the ministries involved and said, this time we play along. If you ever do this again, we will publicly reject your claim. This sets the boundaries. The KfW is its own master. The opposite also applies, that with the case of Klaus Dorn, managing director since 1954, he has to more or less resign in 1960 because he went on too many, in particular, export development funding projects on his own without having them organized, agreed by the ministries. When he resigns, there is outright delight in the economics ministry. In summary, the KfW is not dissolved in the mid-1950s, which could have signified the completion of the reconstruction process. Instead, it continues its operation in areas of national economic importance or political influence. Export loans to India in 1957 come to mind. Mittelstandsförderung, funding for small and medium-sized enterprise in the late 50s, and so on. This is done all without interfering within the business of traditional banks. And it is done by applying the blueprint ABS has created. As the KfW wrote in an obituary in the year he died, schuf die Kreditanstalt nach seinen Vorstellungen. He created the KfW according to his ideas. This makes the KfW a government tool in the reconstruction process and way beyond up to the present day. Development aid, we will hear about this later on, is one task, but it is not the only one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting paper and a very interesting presentation. I would like to invite questions, if I can see them. Hopefully, Jan Kranen has a question. Jan, it's your turn.
So one question to Armin Grünbacher is, you said they play a special role because of ABS vision, let's say, but what made ABS ideas last? Could you trace down the, let's say, the constitutional or institutional features that made this special functioning survive even his own time and his own influence?
I think the way the KfW operated, in particular in the 1950s, late 1950s, it's called die Wirtschaftspolitische Feuerwehr des Bundes, the economic policy fire brigade of the federal government.
But that's not independence.
It is independent that, yes, there are federal ministers on the board, on the supervisory board, who can steer into certain directions. But the government itself cannot just order them, cannot order the bank to do certain things. If the bank does not want to do it, they don't have to do it, if the majority of the supervisory board would agree to not doing it. But to give you another example where they worked very closely with the federal government, 1988, there's a big development aid project funded by the KfW, which for Jordan, which turned out to be Tornado fighter jets. Once this leaks to the public, the project has to be withdrawn. In this case, it shows the KfW had been briefed, the KfW by the government, the KfW is prepared to do the funding. The Yugoslavia case showed we are not prepared to do everything. We need at least to be consulted. If you consult us, we go along with it. Otherwise, we won't. The model, when you look at the activities of the KfW, from reconstruction of housing, of industry, of land cultivation, Flurbereinigung in Germany is partly paid. Mittelstandsförderung, the loans to small and medium-sized businesses. Eventually, development aid. Since the 1980s, late 1980s, investment in environmental protection. Large parts of the cost of reunification had been covered by the financed by the KfW.
Yeah.
The withdrawal of Russian troops from the GDR, the building of the houses for them in Russia, Soviet Union, had been financed. So there is a perfect tool that is not in the public view. It's absolutely brilliant for political reasons. You can finance projects that are important economically or politically without having going to the public market and having to face potentially difficult questions from private banks and their shareholders.
Okay.
Sorry, long answer.
It's a long answer, but it's a very important question because, of course, your presentation raises the interest in whether the specific structure that Hermann Josef Abs seems to have introduced and shaped, whether this has remained until today. And it's very interesting what you say about the early years, and also with this remark more about the later years, because it casts a rather positive light on the public bank. And we're going to see much more of the same in the two following presentations by Celia and Ilaria. And I switch over, and thank you very much, Armin.
Thank you.
And let us now turn to Ilaria Pasotti, who is an in-house historian in Intesa Sanpaolo Group. It's a pleasure to have you here on this panel, and you talk, please, about Istituto Mobiliare Italiano.
Here we are with the presentation. So the paper deals with the role played by the Istituto Mobiliare Italiano as an instrument for the state intervention in the Italian economy. In particular, we focus on the 2 decades after the post-World War II, when the Institute was a privileged interlocutor in the provision of subsidized credit, which was the main instrument of economic policy to support industry. The criticism arise against this instrument pointed out the negative effect on the ability of credit institutions to select companies and investment projects. With particular reference to the IMI, scholars have argued that its broad involvement with this policy led to its crisis at the end of the 1970s. Without disputing the validity of this argument, it may be recognized, however, that the Institute, as a public credit institution, tried to combine the support to industry within the framework of the government policy with the application of rigorous criteria in assessing the creditworthiness of industrial initiatives. After a brief outline of the institutional model, I trace the evolution of the Institute activity, and then I illustrate a case study of IMI lending that demonstrates how the Institute interpreted the objectives of economic policy with the rigorous assessment of creditworthiness. The IMI has its origin in the intervention of the state to tackle the 1929 crisis, which had affected the largest industrial groups as well as the major Italian universal banks. It was the first step towards an overall reform of the banking system, which was completed in 1936 and was based on the separation between the bank and the industry on the one hand, and on the functional and operational specialization of intermediaries on the other. The IMI was assigned the task to facilitate bank disinvestment while trying to ensure more adequate forms of financing for the functioning and development of industry. It was shaped according to a project by Alberto Beneduce, an economist and politician who had already designed the first Institute for Industrial Credit in the 1910s and 20s. As the other Beneduce Institute, the IMI was an institution of public law, therefore the weight of government entities was predominant in both the ownership structure and the composition of the management bodies. Moreover, while it was preventing from collecting deposit, it was entitled to fund its provision by issuing bonds that carry special privilege, for instance, state guarantee. However, the IMI differed from the Benedictine Institute as it was entrusted with not only granting loans, but also underwriting equity in companies. In 1936, IMI's role was strengthened with respect to other industrial credit institutions. The maximum duration of the loans was extended from 10 to 20 years. It could also establish branches. Moreover, the Consorzio per le Sovvenzioni di Valori Industriali, that was the first Italian industrial credit institution created in 1930 to support the industry during the war, became an autonomous section of IMI. Finally, the governor of the Bank of Italy was also appointed chairman of the institute. The autonomy from the top management of the Bank of Italy was restored shortly after the end of the World War II. However, since then, a strong connection with the central bank was preserved in practice. The general director of the Bank of Italy was appointed as deputy chairman of the IMI. In 1936, two relevant innovations for the governance were adopted. The chairman's mandate was without time limit. Moreover, the members of the management bodies appointed by the government increased in number compared to those appointed by the shareholdings. In the following 2 decades, the Institute came to pursue a different vision of public interest that was finally formulated in the Statute of 1962. The mission of the IMI was to contribute to the development and strengthening of the Italian economy by carrying out credit and financial operations in general. Consequently, all the limitations of duration and form of funding were overcome, and to a large extent in those of funding its provision, with only the exception of collecting deposits. As well as all nationalistic distinction fell as regards the currency, no longer only the Italian lira, the territorial area, no longer restricted to that of Italian sovereignty, and the beneficiaries, no longer limited to companies of Italian nationality. Even if the IMI was conceived by the government authority at the center of the industrial credit system until the post-World War II, it was far from achieving the goals that were assigned to it. Under the first chairman, Teodoro Meyer, IMI followed a very prudential lending policy. The acquisition of shareholding was excluded, as well as a rescue operation of the companies with financial relations with the banks in crisis. It was given priority to debt restructuring loans against those supporting new investment. The displacement effect suffered by 2 entities, the Sezione Finanziamenti Industriali, the house bank of the IRI, the entity that was created in 1934 to take over the control of the major universal banks, and the Consorzio per le Sovvenzioni dei Valori Industriali also contributed to its limited activity in these early years. The chairmanship of Vincenzo Azzolini restricted the Institute operational autonomy and held back its territorial decentralization. However, it was beneficial on the side of the funding its provision, as the IMI was given a priority in issuing bonds, authorization, and in the placement of bonds. Even without reaching a pivotal position in the industrial credit system between the mid-1930s and the first half of the 1940s, the share of the IMI progressively increased on the consistency of loans granted by the system, passing from 7% in 1936 to 32.5% in 1945. The loans with financial purposes gradually gave way to those supporting the demand for industrial investment connected to the autarky and the warmongering policy. It was also entrusted with ship financing. Starting from the second post-World War II, the IMI, under the dynamic chairmanship of Stefano Siglienti, was able to hold a prominent position in the industrial credit system. Firstly, it played a key role in Italy's recovery, being entrusted exclusively by the government with the management of special funds and international loans, such as the Exim Bank loans in 1947 and the European Recovery Programme loans. Then, when the economic recovery was achieved, the IMI became the major instrument of government policy of favorable credit terms in three main fields: export credit, the promotion of the industrialization of the Mezzogiorno, and also the improvement of technological innovation in industry. Starting from the mid-1960s, while recording the shrinking expansion of subsidized credit, especially in the South and for particular categories of industry, such as the petrochemical, in its annual reports, the Institute drew the attention of the authorities to the concern that they could turn into welfare credits. The Institute remarked that to avoid negative spillovers, two criteria should be rigorously assessed: the economic validity of the project by taking into account the dimensional, technological, organizational, financial, and the income implication that the growing competition in the integrated market imposes to the company, and the patrimonial and financial solidity of the borrowing company. In particular, on the basis of its experience, it also suggested the opportunity of a more correct proportion between own means and credit means in order to have a greater guarantee on the sound company management and the ability of the company to overcome the adverse phases of an economic situation. The case study of the loans granted to Pignone demonstrated IMI's adherence to these criteria, while acknowledging the exceptional situation in which the application were made. For example, we mention one of these loan applications that was made as part of the management entrusted exclusively to IMI to support the conversion and the reconstruction of the industry in 1936. Pignone was among the companies that had heavy difficulties in restructuring its production from war to peace purposes. During the World War II, Pignone had strongly expanded its activity in military supplies. Moreover, in the final years of the conflict, it was took over by Esnia Viscosa, an important industrial group specialized in the production of the artificial textile fibers. Who aim to place the mechanical production of the company at its service. The company applied for 106 million of lire to meet an adequate supply of raw materials, in the absence of which all forecasts of 1946 production could fail, putting the company in the painful need to close various plants. The forecast provided by the company highlighted, in addition to the scarcity of financial resources to cope with the need provision, also the problem of keeping the excess of manpower employed in unproductive sectors. The trade union also voted to the IMI's chairman to support the company's law application. While acknowledging the uncertainty about the profitability and the difficulty of firing, the IMI's inspector noted that the company was in an effective productive phase, and it seems to head towards a full settlement. With regard to the prospect, then, it was remarked that the company could take advantage of both its technical experience in production, in which it was competitive, and Esnia Viscosa's trading network for the export of its new production, the textile machinery. It was precisely on the role of Sneer Viscosa that the inspector insisted. The parent company should have reserved all or most of the mechanical work to the Pignone, and at the same time should have to intervene with its own capital to smooth out the financial difficulties of the company. Hence, the decision of the IMI to grant a credit of 70 million with two provisions: a recapitalization carried out by Sneer Viscosa and the reorganization of the production process by moving workforce from less to more efficient sectors. In conclusion, IMI was a public credit institution that was at the service of the government policy to support industry. It started to play this role from the mid-1930s with the autarkic and the warmongering policy. Yet it assumed a prominent position against the other industrial credit institutions in the post-World War II, when firstly it was entrusted with the special management of a fund for reconstruction, and then when became greatly involved in the government policy of subsidized credit in the 1950s and 1960s. Very critical on the development of the government policy of subsidized credit, the IMI managed this credit by applying rigorous criteria in the assessment of loan application, subordinating the lending to conditions that affected the organizational structure and management choices of the company, especially when the outstanding debt were excessive or social purposes of the loan prevailed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank all those who made presentations. Thank all those who are still there, and wish you a good break. And we'll see each other again at 2 o'clock when Jan Kran takes over the moderation. Thank you, Zeliha. Thank you, Ilaria. Thank you, Armin. Thank you, Reinhard, and all the others. And Oscar, it's good to see you.